Chapter Spooks.
G'day, and welcome to Chapter Spooks, where we talk about the books that keep your kids up at night. And today we've got an interesting chapter in the Bone Chillers series, because the book we're looking at today is Frankenturkey II. Now, for those of you who haven't been following this whole series along, this is the sequel to an earlier book in the series, Frankenturkey, and this book deals with two things, I think you would call them tropes, two tropes when it comes to Chapter Spooks books, which, in my eyes, have a lot of potential, but are often both done very badly, more often than not. The first one is so obvious that it's right there in the title, Frankenturkey II. It's what I call the series sequel. So these books tend to be anthological. Anthology, a whole bunch of separate stories, the Monster of the Week, different episode, often different characters. And so to me, the idea of bringing back the same characters to sort of deal with the same problem is interesting. I mean, that's where you get a lot of horror movies out there, a lot of slasher movies, be it Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street. They bring back the same character and they do the same thing and they do it in another movie. And it can be interesting, it can be a lot of fun. Although even with horror movies, they tend to completely change the canon just to bring a character back, because with a lot of these things, they usually end the first movie by killing the slasher, so you don't really have many places to go. How can you continue a story that's already had a beginning, a middle, and an end? And the same is true of these stories, especially here with Frankenturkey. The last story ended with the creature dying, being struck by lightning, and then being eaten for dinner because it's a turkey. So there's not really much you can do with that. So I was curious to see how they continue the series, but the thing is, it wasn't really a story that was begging for a sequel. It already ended. And I think that you could plan this out if you had the idea at the beginning, but I feel like, especially with the way that these sequels happen, it's almost like it wasn't the writer that came up with it, but the publisher or the editor. It's like they said, hey, that was a popular book, let's do it again. Because even looking at the other books in this series, even Bone Chillers itself, I'd argue that Little Pet Shop of Horrors had more potential that could have been used for a series. Because, you have a liquid, which anyone can drink, and then they would turn into an animal, which may or may not be based on their persona. And whilst the main bad guy in that died, it's the chemical that is the main draw of the stories. That's the main hook that actually gets the story moving. And you can make a sequel with that. You could do all kinds of things with that. Sure, I didn't like the series because of the whole animal abuse angle, but that's not necessary for a sequel. And hey, you could do so much with it. So yeah, I don't really know why Frankenturkey was picked for this, because it really has no business being a sequel. And in fact, it's for that reason that we get the second trope that we'll be talking about today, which is, quite simply, be careful what you wish for. That's right, this book is all about wishes and dark wishes and things, and that again is a trope that I think could be done so well. If you haven't read The Monkey's Paw by W.W. Jacobs, please go and do that right now. It's a short story, you can pause this, go read it and come back, because to me that is the epitome of the good be careful what you wish for story. The good dark wish sort of trope story. It's done so well, the writing is very evocative. The downside therein is that it's so good that a lot of stories just basically copy and paste it. They do the exact same thing. They do that same thing in The Wishmaster, they do it in other stories. And whilst those other stories, things like the movie The Wishmaster, which is quite enjoyable, even though it steals that, they have their own sort of attitude there. But I think that's the issue with the Be Careful What You Wish For story, especially with the Three Wishes style, is that when you're introducing a magic like that, where anything you say can become real through a wish, ironically, there's not a lot of places you can go, because once you bring in the infinite, the only way to defeat it is with something just as infinitely powerful, especially using it back against itself. So, yeah, it doesn't really work. And so that's the reality. A lot of these books, especially chapter spooks, because I have seen a version of the Three Wishes rule type story where you can have the wish and where it's the devil and you need to use your wishes to get rid of the devil. That's really well done in my opinion. But yeah, a lot of kids books don't even go that route. They just repeat the exact same thing from The Monkey's Paw, but do it poorer because they can't go into the amount of detail and horrific scene setting and suspense of that story. Or you do exactly what this book did, and you just do an incredibly ridiculous, completely out of nowhere ending where you use magic to solve magic without explaining the magic. I think the only way to explain just how poorly this is done is by actually telling you what happens. So without further ado, let's get into Bone Chillers number 7, Frankenturkey II. First things first, we're introduced to our main character, Annie Dugan, which I find rather clever because for those of you who recall, the main character of the last book was her brother Kyle, so it's fun we're getting an interesting new dynamic going with a sister this time, especially because Kyle is being a bit of a jerk. Now that he's got a friend with Jake and some of the kids at school, he's not hanging out with his sister as much, and he keeps calling her stupid all the time, just basically being an annoying older brother. And then Annie informs us that the main driving force of the last book, Gobbledygook, that's the good turkey from Frankenturkey, died 6 months ago. He was hit by a car. We're just going to set aside the fact that I don't understand how a turkey that spends all its time in a pen in the backyard got hit by a car on the road. But yeah, setting that aside, their mother, Mrs. Dugan, then says, hey, why don't you kids clean out the toy box? Because apparently it's overflowing with old toys they barely play with. So the kids start cleaning out the toy box, and it's got so much crud in there, they actually find in the box a wishbone. It's the wishbone from the turkey last year, from the Frankenturkey, which is really gross. You don't keep anything, even from a cooked turkey, you don't keep bones in a toy box. That's how you get ants. This then sets off one of my most hated tropes in fiction, which is the as you know conversation. So this is when Annie says, hey, this is that bone from Frankenturkey. You know, the one that we fought last year. And Kyle's like, yeah, that was the one who it came to life when it was struck by lightning, when we put coat hangers and a monster mask together. She's like, yeah, and then we had to defeat it to eat. You know what I'm saying? This is the worst kind of way to exposit anything in a story. It would make more sense to have one of the characters just start writing a diary entry. As cliched as that is, it makes so little sense for this character. They literally keep saying, yeah, I know what you're talking about, because of course they know what you're talking about. They're not talking to each other, they're talking to the audience. And it's not something I really understand because I'm a bit of a book collector, so I always read these books in sequence. But I guess there are some kids out there who didn't read Frankenturkey I before Frankenturkey II. So whatever. It's still such a horrible way to exposit this information to the reader, especially because all you really need to know is that last year they fought a monster turkey that was brought alive by lightning, and it was a monster, it was magical. That's all you really need to know. You don't need all the details. Their father, Mr. Dugan, sees them playing around with this wishbone, and rather than being rightly disgusted that they're keeping body parts in the toy box, he says, hey, why don't you pull it apart and make a wish? That's what a wishbone's for. Whoever gets the bigger piece gets to make a wish. And the kid's like, oh, that's a good idea, let's try that. Although, that does beg the question, if they didn't know what a wishbone was for, why did they keep it? Anyway, what matters is that they then try doing the wishbone thing. So Annie's like, she's going to wish for Gobbledygook to come back to life. And Kyle, who sort of doesn't really believe in this and doesn't really care about all this, just says, oh, I wish Jake would come over to play because I'm sick of talking with my stupid sister. I'm paraphrasing, but he basically says that. So they pull on the bone to find out who will win their wish, and the wishbone snaps perfectly in two. Right down that little thin blade. Both of them get the quote-unquote biggest piece. So they're both not really sure whose wish should come true, but then there's a knock at the door, and it's Jake who wants to come over and play with Kyle. So I guess it's his wish that came true, right? But that night, as Annie is lying in bed, she is awoken by a sound from outside. No, could it be true? She sat up in bed and held her breath as she looked around the silent room. Moonlight streamed in through the window. The row of stuffed animals on top of her dresser looked frozen in time. Annie sighed. It must have been my imagination, she thought, and snuggled back under the covers. Gobble, 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 gobble. Annie sat bolt upright. This time she knew she had heard something. Jumping out of bed, she raced out to the window and looked down at the pen. Gobbledygook, she squealed. It's you! Gobble, gobble. Annie rubbed her eyes. I must be dreaming, she thought. Looking again, she shrank back in terror. It wasn't a dream. It was a nightmare. Gobbledygook's eye sockets were empty, one wing was broken and dangling down his side. Most of his feathers were missing, and tatters of rotting skin hung from his body. Annie shook her head slowly. She couldn't believe it. There had to be some mistake. Maybe her eyes were playing tricks on her after all. She unlatched the window and raised it slowly. Maybe if she got a closer look? The moment she stuck her head outside, an unbelievable stench filled her nose. "Phew," she said, gagging. It smelled like the dead mouse her mother had found behind the refrigerator last month, only 100 times worse. She slammed the window shut. Gobbledygook had come back from the dead. When I first read this, I thought it was another fake-out dream sequence like these Chapter Spooks books love to do. But no, this is real. Annie goes running to her brother's room for help, and she wakes him up and they go outside to help Gobbledygook because they need to go hide him in the barn because they're worried what will happen when their parents see there's a zombie turkey in their yard. So they go out to help, and immediately they're hit with the smell of this thing. This is a rotten corpse. There are maggots crawling in its eyes. Almost all of the feathers are gone. That wing that is broken and hanging is hanging by just a few strands of flesh. This bird is nasty. So they hide it in the barn. They put a little bit of turkey feed on the ground, some leftover from last year. And they decide that they're going to take it and hide it in the woods like they did before so that they can hide it from their parents. It's just they're trying to keep it safe in the meantime. The next morning, Annie is a bit upset at her brother for two reasons. Firstly, as they go into the barn to fix it up, Jake is with them because he told his best friend all about it, so he's coming in to help, even though she was hoping they'd keep this more of a secret. Secondly, he and Jake keep saying that this is Frankenturkey. The Frankenturkey's come back. She's insisting, no, it's Gobbledygook. I wish for him back. He's back. But because he keeps squawking out in pain and he looks absolutely horrific, they keep saying that, no, this could be Frankenturkey. So they head into the barn, and as soon as the smell hits Jake, he just runs to the corner and throws up because it still smells like a putrid corpse. But they notice that the bird is looking a lot better. Some of its feathers have grown back, its foot doesn't seem to be as broken, and its wing that was hanging by a thread is now just tucked under it and looks like a broken wing as opposed to a just about amputated wing. So Jake takes the chicken wire and Kyle takes the food and the water, but Kyle insists that Annie be the one to take the turkey into the pen because he wants to keep as far away from it as he can because he's still sort of convinced that it's Frankenturkey. He doesn't know for sure, and that's why he still wants to help it, just in case this could still maybe be their beloved Gobbledygook. But no, he wants to keep his distance just in case Frankenturkey has come back. And in fact, I kind of like the fact that they say that the bird's eyes are missing, because from the other book, they say that Frankenturkey and Gobbledygook originally looked exactly the same, the only difference being that Frankenturkey had creepy, horrible red eyes. So I kind of like that. It sort of leaves a little air of mystery there. Not to mention maggots in the face, eyeballs. Creepy, gross. Gotta love it for a spooky book. So they head back home, and that night, Annie has another dream. She gets a strange feeling, and she goes out into the woods where Gobbledygook is in his little cave. So she heads in, and she sees that he's looking almost as good as new. All of his feathers have come back, his beak is glistening, his eyes have even grown back. He looks amazing, but something just isn't right. Puzzled, Annie reached out and stroked the soft feathers. Gobble, 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 gobble. He leaned toward her, pressing her hand deep inside. Gobble, gobble, squawk! You're trying to tell me something, aren't you, Gobbledygook? Annie asked anxiously. Squawk, squawk! She plunged her hand deeper into the feathers until she felt the soft flesh. It was too soft. There was no bone. At first she didn't understand. Are you trying to tell me that you're perfect again except for one missing bone? She asked. Squawk! Squalled the turkey, hopping up and down and flapping his wings. Then it dawned on Annie. The wishbone, she cried. You want the wishbone that I wished you back to life on. Gobbledygook flapped his wings excitedly again. Don't worry, Gobbledygook. I'll get it for you right now. Annie whirled around and raced back to the house. The empty family room seemed strange in the darkness. She dug frantically through the toy box until she finally found the wishbone's broken halves. Grabbing a piece in each hand, she stumbled through the woods again, the cold, wet snow clinging to her bedroom slippers. Annie was panting breathlessly when she reached the cave. Gobbledygook was waiting, pressed up against the wire. His glittering eyes followed her as she hurried through the clearing. Here it is, just like you wanted, she cried between gulping breaths. She held the halves of the wishbone out toward the bird. As he strutted forward, head held high and chest thrust out, Annie felt the two pieces of wishbone wiggle their way out of her hands. She watched in amazement as they hung suspended in the air in front of her and fused together into one big wishbone. Then, with a blinding flash of light, the wishbone disappeared into the plumage of the bird's chest. Annie gasped and stepped back, her eyes wide. After this dream, Annie assumes that she's seen something prophetic, something that she needs to know, so she tries to find the wishbone in the toy box so that she can take it to Gobbledygook, but she can't find it. So, after a while, she decides her dream mustn't have meant anything, and she goes back to bed. But when she lies in her bed, she sees her slippers under the window. She sees a wet leaf fall off one of them, and on the other, a bit of snow falls down and melts into the carpet. And she thinks that dream may not have been a dream after all. The next morning, Annie goes down to check on Gobbledygook, alone because her brother Carl's off playing ice hockey. But she goes down to check on him, and sure enough, he looks as good as new. He's full of life, he doesn't smell anymore, his eyes have in fact grown back. So she's excited to have her bird back, but she doesn't like the idea of leaving him out here in the cave. But then she gets an idea. She frees him from the cave and she walks him back up to the house and shows her parents. Seeing the turkey, the parents do the responsible thing. They say, well, we should call around and see if anyone's lost a turkey, especially one that looks fattened up like that one. So we should see if anyone's lost it. What if someone was going to eat that for Thanksgiving dinner? And Annie says, I wish you guys wouldn't talk like that. And then, wouldn't you know, both the parents say, you know what, yeah, let's just keep him. It's just like Gobbledygook. Let's keep him in the yard. Oh, that was lucky. When Carl and Jake come back from their ice hockey game, they're also surprised to see that the parents allowed them to keep the turkey again. The only thing that's a little weird is that as soon as their dog sees the bird, the dog called Trouble, he starts barking and growling at it. Which is strange because the two animals got along really well in the last book. So when Annie says that it's strange, Kyle responds in the dumbest way possible. He says, and I quote, "If 1 human year is equal to 7 dog years, then half a year would be 3.5 years to him. Do you expect Trouble to remember something that happened 3.5 years ago?" I'm going to need to go on another little tangent. Okay. So, dog years. For the record, dog years aren't years that are accelerated. The only reason why people explain dog years that way is to explain their lifespan. Most humans live about 90, dogs live about 12. And so that's just the maths of how it works out. Because I guess it's a little scary to kids to instead say, oh, your dog's going to die in 12 years. You say, oh no, he's living dog years. So it's like he's growing up a lot faster. Which isn't even accurate in of itself, because whilst that's true of their lifespan, it's not true of their life period. Human beings have an adolescence and a childhood. A lot of animals don't have that. A lot of animals have a very brief childhood where they're still developing, and then they're pretty much little adults for the rest of their lives. They reach sexual maturity very fast. It's another difference between humans and animals. So the 7 years thing is complete nonsense. Anyone who says a dog has 7 years, it's just a little math trick. It has nothing to do with the way that dogs learn, especially not their memory. Not to mention, 3.5 years, if I had a friend who I got along with really well, I'd remember them 10 years down the line. I've done that in the past. What on earth is this nonsense? The only reason I'm not more mad is because these are kids saying this, although I should mention that Kyle was the main character of the last book and we're supposed to agree with and empathize with him. Even so, at least it's just kids saying this. It's not someone with authority like a teacher in the last book. Good grief. Anyway, Carl keeps being stupid because then Annie says, well, I just wish that Trouble wouldn't keep barking at Gobbledygook. I wish he wouldn't act like that. And Kyle says, well, he's acting like a dog. Or would you prefer him to act like a cat? And Annie, as sick of this shtick as I am, says to him, you know what? Yeah, I wish he would act like a cat around him. Then he wouldn't keep barking at him. So there, smart guy. And you know what? I'm proud of this little girl for standing up to her big brother. But then, Trouble curls up in a little ball and starts purring. And that's when the kids realize what's going on. They're wishing around the wishbone, and it's coming true. They head into the house, and Annie wants to talk about it, but Trouble starts acting like a dog again, so her brother Kyle just says, well, look, he's like a dog again, I don't know what was going on, let's just ignore it. Although he's ignoring the fact that she said, I wish he'd act like a cat. around Gobbledygook, and in a later scene that does happen. So I guess this is just another example of Kyle becoming stupid because he's not the main character anymore. But the next day, the kids are hanging around, Gobbledygook seems to be acting normal, but when their dad gets home from work, Trouble comes out to greet them, but as soon as he walks past the pen with Gobbledygook in it, he starts meowing and purring again. And Annie starts panicking. She's worried that he'll see that something strange is going on, and they don't know how to explain it, so she gets upset. She tries getting Trouble to move and says, "Look, act like a dog. You're a dog. Stop doing this." And her dad walks past, and as he gets up to Trouble, Trouble looks up to him and meows, and he leans down, pets the dog, and walks past into the house. Because he wasn't paying attention. He's got other things on his mind. So the kids go inside to see what's going on, and he says, "Look, I need to talk to you about something." And yeah, the whole time they're thinking, oh, this is about the dog meowing, isn't it? But no, he sits them down and says, "Look, I've got some bad news. We're gonna have to eat Gobbledygook for Thanksgiving." The kids are horrified at this, but he explains, "Look, I haven't really told you all about this, but I actually lost my job. So we don't have the money to afford a turkey for Thanksgiving, and it's serendipity. He just fell into our laps, so we're gonna have to eat him for dinner." And I like the little plot element they throw in that he mentions offhandedly, "I always used to wish I didn't have to drive to work every day, so I guess this is what I get." Hinting that the magic is behind this as well. But both the kids are horrified because, of course, they know this is Gobbledygook. This is that turkey they both cared about so much last year. So they're both saying, "Look, no, you can't eat the turkey. We love him so much. He's like our pet." And the mother actually turns to Kyle and says, "Look, I wish you'd just try to understand." And then, of course, his face goes blank for a second. He says, "You know what? Okay, maybe he'll be delicious." And Annie is horrified by this. She doesn't even seem to realize that it's because of the wish. She just can't believe that her brother would want to eat their beloved pet turkey. But it's 3 against 1 now. She can't win, so they all decide they're going to eat the turkey. Later, she goes to her brother's room to complain and says, "How on earth could you do that? He's our beloved pet turkey. Why would you want to eat him?" And obviously, because the spells worked its magic, he says, "Look, we have no choice. Dad lost his job." And he says, "But I thought you loved him." And he says, "Yeah, well, I love him more with stuffing." So Anne just runs out of the house to go to Gobbledygook, and she's crying. She says to him, "Look, I can't believe they're doing this to you. I can't believe my brother could be so cruel. In fact, you know what? I wish that they weren't going to eat you for Thanksgiving dinner, that instead of eating you, you were getting skinnier and skinnier, and my brother was getting fatter and fatter, getting fattened up for Thanksgiving dinner." But she didn't mean it. She was just angry. As soon as she realizes her word, she goes inside to check on her brother to make sure he's okay, and he's just sitting on the couch. He looks perfectly fine. So she thinks, okay, maybe that wish won't come true. But of course, we know that's not the case. The next morning at breakfast, Carl eats 4 bowls of cereal, 7 pieces of toast, and after he's finished that, he says, "I'm still not full. What else do we have to eat?" And her dad starts cooking up pancakes and sausages, and Carl starts ballooning in size, which is a little bit gross because it's literally happening in hours. In 3 days, he goes from a regular sized kid to a balloon. But what's the most unsettling about this is the nonchalant way that the parents and Kyle talk about eating him. Both the parents are like, "Yeah, we're going to fatten him up, we'll feed him fudge and pancakes for dinner if we have to." And Kyle's like, "Yeah, I'm looking forward to this, I got to be careful or I won't fit in the oven." So Annie tries and fails to convince her family that this is deeply disturbed. After a while, she comes up with an idea. Obviously, something's wrong with her family. So she goes to the only person she thinks she can trust, Jake. And I really like this because even though he's not as much of a bully character as he was last year, he's still a little bit of a jerk. But more importantly, he's Kyle's friend. He's not her friend, so she basically has to go to him and plead with him to come and help her to save her brother from Frankenturkey, which also he'd be traumatized by because it threatened him last year and attacked him. I really do like the dynamic here that the young sister has to go to the brother's friend for help. Especially because he's not at school when she goes looking for him, and she's worried that maybe the same thing's happening to him, maybe his parents are fattening him up. But when she goes to his house, she realizes it's just him being a jerk. He was skipping school, pretending to have a cold, because he wanted to take a few days off school. See what I mean? It's a fun dynamic. But my favorite bit is, despite the fact that Jake has been a bully in the past, Annie goes to him and she says, first off, she says, Oh my god, you can't believe this. So first of all, my brother is just eating and eating. If he's not careful, he's going to get really fat. And Jake's response is, yeah, he likes his food, so what? Look, because a lot of the horror comes from how much Kyle is ballooning up, I'm not going to pretend that this book is all about body positivity, but I do think that that character moment is the nicest these books have ever gotten towards treating fat people with respect. So you know what? I'm taking it. Anyway, because of that character dynamic where he really isn't her friend, he doesn't believe anything that she's saying, but because she looks so scared and she is talking about gobbledygook and Frankenturkey, and there was magic involved in that, he decides to follow her to her house to see whether or not she is as crazy as she sounds. I kind of get the impression he's doing this because if she's wrong, he thinks it'll be funny. So Jake heads back to the Dugan house, where we see Mr. Dugan and Kyle in the kitchen. Annie glanced around the kitchen. She was surprised Kyle wasn't there, consuming more food. Then she noticed the pantry door ajar. "Kyle, are you in there?" she asked, pulling it open. "Yeah, and man, am I starved!" Annie shrank back in horror. Kyle was sitting in the middle of the pantry floor with the can opener in one hand and a can of green beans in the other. Empty cans of vegetables and fruit were scattered around him. While Annie and Jake watched in amazement, Kyle opened the can and downed the contents in one big gulp. Then he tore open a packet of spaghetti and crammed the long pieces of uncooked pasta into his mouth. "Jeez," Jake said. He was standing beside Annie, staring bug-eyed at Kyle. "What's going on?" Kyle looked up at his friend and tried to smile, but his cheeks were bulging and spaghetti stuck out of his mouth like porcupine quills. In the blink of an eye, he had chewed and swallowed the whole box and was grabbing for something else. "Here, Jake, try this. You'll love it," he said, handing Jake a box of strawberry cake mix. "I just ate the double Dutch chocolate mix a few minutes ago. It was awesome." Jake stood stone still. When he didn't take the mix, Kyle tore open the box and scooped out a handful, popping it into his mouth. "See, this is all you have to do," he said. "Wow, that's really good," he added, taking another scoop before thrusting the box toward Jake. Jake took the mix, but he didn't eat it. Instead, he gave Kyle a frightened look. Are you okay?" he asked in a trembly voice. "Sure," said Kyle, as he opened a bottle of vinegar and drank it down. "Just a little hungry, that's all." "Kyle," Mr. Dugan called from behind them, "come here a minute. I want to see if you'll fit in the oven, or if I'll have to get the gas grill out of the barn." "Sure, Dad," Kyle said happily. He lumbered to his feet and started waddling across the kitchen toward the stove. "But I'd rather be cooked outdoors on the grill. It would make it seem more like Thanksgivings we used to have when we lived in Florida." Suddenly, Jake lunged for Kyle and tackled him to the floor. "What's the matter with everybody?" Jake yelled. "Have you all gone crazy?" Kyle managed to wriggle out of Jake's grasp. "No, stupid," he snapped. "We're just getting me ready for Thanksgiving dinner." So the kids decide that they have to do something. This is obviously Frankenturkey's doing. Whether that's gobbledygook or Frankenturkey, it obviously has some curse where not only is it allowing the wishes to come true, but it's also making them make certain wishes. Like the wish against her brother, she didn't want to do that. So obviously, this is Frankenturkey's revenge. It made her wish that they would eat her brother to get revenge on the fact that they all ate him. Jake's immediate response is they need to kill Frankenturkey, cut him open, and get the wishbone out. Annie points out that they can't do that because Frankenturkey is the source of the power. If he sees he's in danger, he'll use his power to save himself. So they decide to come up with a plan. They need to make him think they're doing it for his own good. So they decide they'll tell him that he's at risk of being eaten for Thanksgiving dinner, so they need to hide him in the woods like last time. And this time, Jake will be there ready to push a boulder in front of the cave to lock him inside. So that's what they do. Annie sneaks inside, and whilst Frankenturkey is a bit wary of her getting close, she says, no, it's just in case. Like my brother said, he doesn't fit in the oven, so hey, if he doesn't fit in there, they might have to eat you instead. So that seems to convince him, and so he follows her as she puts food behind her to make him follow as they head out to the cave. And she just manages to get a glance of Jake hiding above the cave, ready to push the boulder down, as she gets Frankenturkey to follow her to the front entrance of the cave. But he doesn't go in at first. He doesn't trust her. So she sends Trouble, who is still acting like a cat, so he doesn't really do as she says, but she manages to usher him inside to show that there's nothing dangerous inside the cave. So then when he walks out, Frankenturkey finally walks in, and she yells out, "Now!" And Jake pushes the boulder and manages to drop it in front of the cave entrance. we're going to ignore the fact that no kid would be strong enough to push a boulder over, because as he does, it says that there's like a cascade of rocks around. So I'm choosing to believe that as he pushed it, it just caused a small rock slide that had all of the rocks at the top fall down and cover the cave entrance. So they did it, right? Frankenturkey stuck. They solved the problem. But if they solved the problem, why is Jake's face turning purple? She looked around for Jake. He was standing in front of the cave with a weird expression on his face. He looked like he was choking. She ran to him. "Jake, what's wrong?" she shouted. I wish, gurgled Jake. And he looked at him in horror. His face was turning purple, and he was holding his hand over his mouth, trying to stop the words from coming out. She stared wide-eyed at the pile of boulders in front of the cave. It was happening again. Why hadn't she thought of it? If Frankenturkey's power could reach from the barn into the house, it could certainly reach the short distance from the cave to where Jake was standing, and it meant Frankenturkey was alive. I wish Frankenturkey... "Jake, no!" Annie screamed. "Don't say it!" She grabbed his arm, trying to pull him away from the cave. "I wish Frankenturkey wasn't in..." Jake was pressing both hands over his mouth hard, trying to shove the words back down his throat. His eyes were wide, sweat poured down his face. He looked terrified. No, Jake," Annie screamed. "He isn't dead. Let's get out of here. Run!" She clutched his arm tighter and yanked hard. "Oh, please, don't let him do it to you." But Jake wouldn't budge. He gagged, and the rest of the words finally came tumbling out. "I wish Frankenturkey wasn't in that cave." He turned to Annie as a look of shock spread over his face. Slowly, he took his hands away from his mouth and stared at the huge pile of stones. "Oh no. What did I do?" he muttered. They watched in horror as the rock on the very top teetered, settled back, then teetered again. Suddenly it came loose, tumbling down and landing at their feet. Then one by one, other stones came loose. They rolled down the little mountain of rocks until there was a huge, thundering mass hurtling down. "Look out!" shrieked Annie. She jumped aside, pulling Jake after her. Trouble scampered away into the underbrush. The rocks tumbled and smashed and crashed against one another, raising a cloud of dust. Finally, when all was still and the dust was settling, Annie dared to look at the cave opening. Her worst nightmare had come true. The entrance was completely clear, and standing just inside was Frankenturkey. His wings were spread wide, his red eyes glowing like vicious hot coals, and the wishbone in his breast pulsed ominously. I got to admit, that was kind of a cool idea. Very creepily done. But the next scene kind of goes entirely off the rails. So there's a boring bit where they go back to Jake's house, and his parents aren't there, and there's a note on the fridge saying that they're actually the Dugan house. So we then go back to the Dugan house, where Mr. and Mrs. Wilbanks, Jacob's parents, are sitting there with Mr. and Mrs. Dugan and Kyle, and they're all talking about how they invited the Wilbanks over for Thanksgiving dinner. And this is when Annie realizes that this is because they were invited to dinner last year, so obviously this is Frankenturkey punishing all of them for eating him last year, so he's got them all in the same place. And they're talking about how they're going to fatten him up, and in fact, they're even going to borrow Mr. Wilbanks' axe to chop off his head so he could fit in the oven and cook him. And just like the last scene where the family were just nonchalantly talking about cannibalizing their son, Jake just can't handle it. He freaks out again. He picks up the axe and says, "I'm dealing with this once and for all." So he marches outside with the axe. He's going to chop off Frankenturkey's head. Annie is yelling for him to stop because as much as he just wants to end all this, she knows that Frankenturkey has all of the power and all Jake has is an axe. So as he goes into the pen, sneaking up to the bird, which is pretending to sleep, then Kyle comes running out of the house and literally screams out, "You've got the wrong bird," and he lays his head down on the stump saying, "No, chop my head off." And then the parents come out too, and they start chanting for him to chop his head off instead, although apparently they're chanting "Go ahead," which is kind of a weak chant if I'm honest. But anyway, that's not what matters. What matters is that then the power comes over Jake as well, because he slowly turns and walks out of the pen holding the axe, and he raises the axe high, and he then wishes himself, he says, "I wish that every single person that eats Kyle for Thanksgiving dinner will get sick and die." This is getting crazy intense. I was wondering how on earth that we're going to get out of this scene. This felt like the climax of the book, but then the chapter ends, and the resolution, in a word, contrivance. Mrs. Dugan yells out, "Stop! You have to stop." And when Annie's like, oh no, has she broken the curse? No, Mr. Dugan says, look, it's not Thanksgiving yet. If we kill him now, it'll be a few days. He's not going to fit in the fridge. The meat will go off. We can't eat him now. So everyone's like, oh yeah, fine, we won't eat him. Even though Kyle's like pleading, oh, I wanted you to kill me now. But no, they're like, no, we'll wait a few days. So creepy, gross, weird, also contrived and odd, but whatever. So that scene ends. And Annie then goes to bed that night, horrified, terrified, not sure how she's going to stop this. And then we get the actual ending of the book, and it's weird. So what happens is she says, I just got to deal with this myself. So she then goes out that night, goes into the pen where Gobbledygook is, or Frankenturkey, although apparently that's her solution, because it's the body of Gobbledygook, but it seems to have Frankenturkey's mind or power taking him over. So she basically goes in, and the bird just attacks her, because of course it does. It starts like scratching at her, trying to peck at her, and she's yelling out, Gobbledygook, please help me. I love you, Gobbledygook. You're my beloved pet turkey. I love you. And by yelling out, I love you, again and again and again, the bird starts like falling back, like it's like there's something inside of it keeps thrusting it backwards, and she sees in its chest that wishbone which is glowing, but there's something behind the wishbone which is glowing even brighter, and it turns out to be the bird's heart. It's Gobbledygook's heart, pumping and thumping stronger and stronger, and then the heart literally bursts out of the chest and explodes in, and I quote, a tidal wave of blood. It spews forth, cracks the wishbone in two, and spills it out in the blood in the pen. So Frankenturkey was stopped by the power of love. The end. Okay, a couple of things here. First things first. What? I usually leave the whole writer's discussion thing for the end, but I need to get into this right now. So, okay. I don't like fantasy stories, generally speaking. It's a personal quibble. If you enjoy fantasy stories, more power to you, go nuts. But one of the things I don't like about them is when they rely on magic, because magic, by definition, is not real. But more importantly, it can do anything. That's the issue. And so my favorite kind of magic is when you have some kind of a magic system where you lay down the rules very strictly. So whilst people can use them, magic just becomes another tool. So you need to follow its rules. You can't just snap your fingers and have a dragon appear. You know what I'm saying? So that's the kind of magic I prefer, but not everything does that. And in fact, some stories thrive not having a strict magic system that the main characters can exploit. And I'm not saying that every single story needs a magic system, but you need to have some kind of an idea about how it works and the limits. Otherwise, there's nothing stopping this story from being solved in a second. Just look, I wrote down a whole list of wishes, because there's no limit to these wishes. So there's a million different ways you could have ended this story in a second, right? The girl could have said, hey, I wish you weren't evil. I wish you'd die right now. I wish I had the wishbone in my hand. I wish you were struck by lightning. I wish things were back to normal. I wish that this was my last wish. I wish that this would stop. All of these wishes, there's not a single explanation given for why she couldn't wish it. I know we're shown that Frankenturkey can make you wish for something you don't want to, but nothing says that you can't then wish for things that you want to, and the kids do it multiple times. So why on earth do we have to rely on the power of love and a turkey with an exploding heart to stop the magic? That doesn't make a lot of sense. Not to mention, I know I can dwell on this kind of stuff a lot, but honestly, in the start of the book, right, she wishes back Gobbledygook. Now, you could explain that Frankenturkey is a part of him because of the wishbone, but she puts the wishbone in Gobbledygook. Why does Gobbledygook want that? Was that actually a dream? Even though she actually did it? Why is Gobbledygook saying, hey, you gotta put that in me, if that's what makes Gobbledygook evil? What? The magic, this is what I'm saying. None of the magic makes any sense, because this is basically a story where the problem is magic and the solution is magic and the way that it works is magic, right? There's no lines drawn in the sand where magic can and can't do anything. And so this is just a nonsense plot. Something happened, something else happened, and then something fixed it. And how did it work? Magic. It's the reason why I prefer magic systems, but this has to be what I tell people, which is you don't necessarily have to have a magic system, but you need to have a limit. Even if there's not a limit on the magic itself, I'd say here the limit should have been the magic creates the problem. The magic should not solve the problem. It is a literal deus ex machina. That is God coming out of the machine and saying, oh, problem solved. There's no agency from the characters, unless you've got some strange plot, meaning, or moral that's beyond the main conflict of the story. That's fine, but in this, it just doesn't work. And honestly, that kind of sucks, because I really enjoyed Annie's character throughout this book. She's done really well, as is Jake, and I like their dynamic. I mentioned it already, but I like the fact that they don't really get along, but they are clashing personalities. She's just a young girl trying to do her best, and he's literally an ex-bully who's trying to get away with as much as he can. So it kind of, especially with like literally both times when he sees the weird stuff going on, his response is violence. Like, it makes sense for his character. I like the way it's done, and it's not something that she would have done, which is why they're an interesting dynamic. But the story just doesn't work at all. At first I was like, this has nothing to do with Frankenturkey, although arguably the whole eating the brother does sort of fit into it. But no, the issue is that this is not what anyone would have wanted from a Frankenturkey sequel. Nobody who heard, hey, if you like the first book, there's more of it, would have assumed that it was focusing on wishes. I know there was magic and magic lightning in the last one, and that sort of excuses the magic breastbone. Like, that could be an interesting way to bring the turkey back, but they make that the main focus. Why not? Okay, this is what I thought the book was going to do. Why not have it that, yes, you bring Gobbledygook back, but because of the wishbone, he is cursed, he is evil, and so there is a bit of Frankenturkey in him, and then the turkey's like fighting it. So maybe you could even do a thing like, hey, maybe at night Frankenturkey comes out or something. Like, there's the idea of having a character that's good that also has some evil in it, and then having the main characters have to fight it. Like, at the end of the book, they kill Gobbledygook, so they're not afraid to kill off the nice character that's like corrupted with evil. So why can you have that be the main plot? That Gobbledygook is there, and they want to stop him, and maybe you could even have it that the parents want to eat him, but he knows they want to eat him, and so that's when Frankenturkey starts coming back. Like, you could do that. Or hey, you know what else might be fun? 2 words. Lightning powers. Now you have to fight a Frankenturkey who's not only evil and growing bigger and bigger, but also has the ability to shoot lightning at you. That's scary. And hey, you can't stop that with lightning, so what's the solution? Like, that could be interesting. But this book really doesn't use any of the potential that's there. And I guess that's partly because there isn't as much potential as there is with another idea, because they've already used up the ideas for this story. That's literally why that first book ended, and this is a different story. So maybe Betsy Haynes just couldn't see what she could do with the plot, which is fair enough. But it's frustrating to watch her attempt to put the pieces together into something that works. And whilst I don't want to dwell on it too much, it is kind of annoying that whilst Jake has the right attitude towards people being fat, like, yeah, people are fat sometimes, get over it. But no, the book dwells on it so much. Not to mention, we've already seen Back to School, which had a similar thing that was horrifying, that kids were overeating. Because yes, that can be scary sometimes, but it's almost like the writers use it as an excuse to then punch down and pick on someone for being fat. They always describe them as waddling, they always describe them as overeating and food dripping down them and being disgusting. It's just mean. Especially because, and here's where it gets into some fun science. I keep talking about how when you do your research and learn more, you can make stories more interesting. And think about this. In a lot of stories, like I've seen it in cartoons and I've seen it in other horror stories, heck, even back in Hansel and Gretel, kids get fed with sweets and fattening foods in order to quote-unquote fatten them up. The thing is, when you fatten up a creature, what you're doing is you're building up their fat content. If you're trying to make something bigger so that you have a bigger meal, you don't want fat content, you want meat content. Because if you're using cakes and sweets to fatten something up, then you could just be eating cakes and sweets. The reason why we usually eat herbivores is because they eat things like grass and leaves and other things that we don't like the taste of, and they turn that into flesh, which we can eat and which has a denser nutritional content. Whereas if you wanted to eat something like a predator or a human, well, they eat other meat, or in the case of a human, they eat cakes and pies and other things that you could eat. So one of the reasons that we don't eat humans, besides the fact that it's gross, is that it's just not economical. Why feed a person a cake so that it turns into fat when fat doesn't taste nice, but cake does? A lot of people cut off the fat. So what would make more sense to me is to try to build up something's muscle mass. Why has nobody ever done this? Ever had a character that's going to be eaten, and so there's like a secret idea that they're getting more meat on their bones, but they're literally trying to get meat on their bones by having them exercise, by having them eat a diet designed to bulk them up with meat and muscle, as opposed to fatten them up with literal grease. Heck, there's probably a plot there about the idea of gyms and that preying on people's fears of gaining weight, and so the idea of predatory practices. There you go, that's a free idea. If that inspired anything in you, go for it. Because no matter what, it will be a lot better than these stories that just seem to make kids turn into big cake-filled balloons so that they can make fun of them for being overweight. So yeah, there are a couple of scenes that I did like I do like some of the creepy scenes, even some of the ones that I read out for you. And there are even some scenes just describing the town and the trees and the nature, which I think are really well done. So this isn't a horrendous book, but so much of this other stuff drags it down. And for that reason, this book is a C-. As I said at the top of this episode, this teased the potential with a sequel and with a be careful what you wish for plot, but it squanders the potential of both those ideas. It doesn't deserve to be a sequel. It barely even deserves to be a book. I enjoyed a couple of little things, which means I think it's close to passing, but by my estimates, a C- is still a failing grade. Its predecessor, Frankenturkey, got over the line because it had so much fun thrown in there. But this book isn't as fun. It just seems mean and cruel, and it doesn't have as much effort put in there because it just solves all of the issues. It basically uses magic as spackle to fill in all the plot holes, which ironically creates even more plot holes because you're wondering where on earth this magic came from in the first place and why it does what it does. So no, failing grade. See me after class. But as always, I don't want to leave you on that note. I want to leave you with something to take away from this. And I think the first thing I have to take away is, as much as I've talked about the magic systems and stuff, what I'm actually talking about here is an issue with plotting. This is what's known as an and-then plot. Because everything comes from magic is what causes it, but this can happen in any sort of plot. It's an and-then because it's a case of something happens, and then something else happens, and then something else happens, and then something else happens, and literally any one of those could be anything because it doesn't follow on from the last thing that happened, because it's just, in this case, magic causing it. In some other cases, it's just random things happening. A better way to work out your plots so that they're more coherent is, instead of having every scene follow and then, you should have scenes that follow with therefore or however. Now, even the most basic plots follow this idea. So, for instance, it could be, once upon a time, there was a dragon. Therefore, because I was scared, I decided to hide away. However, the dragon destroyed my village. Therefore, I decided to get revenge on the dragon. Therefore, I sought out someone to help me find the magic sword. However, I could not find it on my own. You see what I mean? Like, it's not just oh, and then this popped up, and then this popped up. It's things following on from something else. But my second bit of advice, and I think I've talked about stuff like this before, the idea of diving in and breaking down ideas to their core, because the whole idea of the be careful what you wish for trope is based off the idea that a lot of wishes often have some dark undercurrent. And a lot of those have come from that original story I talked about, The Monkey's Paw. I'm not going to spoil it, go read it, but one of the things you will notice if you read that is there are some interpretations that say that these wishes are being granted with a dark irony, but another position could be that they're simply granting the wishes without any concern for morality. Consider this as an idea, right? This is headcanon, but it often is the case with a lot of these wish stories. Instead of a wish being designed like by a quote-unquote evil genie who's trying to mess with you, what if wishes are granted with the easiest means possible? Like, this is capable of everything, but hey, maybe it's trying to conserve energy. So simple idea, like if someone says, hey, I wish to be famous. On the one hand, if you had to then make someone into a celebrity by making them famous as a movie star, you mean have to be a movie star, have to create movies, have to change history. Or if you just make it that their mother dies under mysterious circumstances and everyone suspects that you were the killer, whilst that's unfortunate for you, it also would be a way to conserve energy from whatever power is granting these wishes, because it's a lot easier to just kill someone than it is to rewrite history and change reality around you. That's not evil, that's not even a curse, that's just simple energy-saving measures. I've actually done a little bit of research into movies that deal with wishes, because I'm interested in writing a story about wishes myself as a horror story, and I find it more interesting, instead of just saying, oh, it's an evil genie, they're just going to do the thing that's nasty because they're nasty, thinking it from a practical perspective. Like even something as simple as, if you wish to be a millionaire, well, unless history changes, a lot of people are going to assume that you're a thief, because if you didn't have $1 million yesterday and you do today, where did it come from? A lot of these stories that deal with things like wishes and magic, with rules like that, the fun doesn't come from, oh, the wish does this now and it does this now, you know, it's something strange happens. It's from the reader and the audience realizing, oh, okay, that's a clever way of solving that problem. Like, until the actual conclusion of this book, I liked the way that they were doing that scene with the kid going with the axe and then the turkey turning against them, because clearly it's showing that Frankenturkey works in a way that it will allow you to do things to it, and you can make wishes if it thinks that it will help Frankenturkey. So how do you kill something by wishing in a way that would help it? That's an interesting challenge. And thus that's my challenge to you, writers out there. If you want to explore a trope like this, don't just repeat the things that the masters have done in the past. They've already done that and they've done it perfectly. I don't think any story has been written better than The Monkey's Paw in regards to wishes, except, like I said, that one with the devil. But I don't want to spoil either story, so we'll leave it there. But don't be afraid to dive in, break it down, and come up with a solution that satisfies everything that people are hoping to get out of these tropes. Anyway, thank you for joining me for this one. I have read it in the past, so I think there's a good likelihood that I'm going to forget this one. It's a little bit forgettable, seeing as how I've read it before and I didn't remember it had anything to do with wishes. But we do have something to look forward to next time, because we're going to deal with a book that I do remember, and I remember enjoying quite a bit. Welcome to Alien Inn. But hey, if you thought this one was scary, just wait to see what I've got in store for you next time.